Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I'm your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight in some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. And today's episode, we'll be talking about the bombing of Flight 629. That's right, we're taking a step back from the Epstein files as I continue my research over there. We're going to be talking about a airplane tragedy that is one of the largest ones prior to 9/11. This case is actually super interesting. I will get into the psychological side of it towards the end, but for the first part, we are going to just kind of lay out the case and go from there. So I'm excited to share this one with you. If you like this type of content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Share it with your family, share it with your friends. It means a lot, and it helps me out in preparing all of this. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. At 6:25 p.m., a United Airlines flight identified as 629 DC-6B, containing 44 people, left the Stapleton Airport in Denver, Colorado, with a destination of Portland, Oregon, on November 1st, 1955. At the same time, a young Conrad Hopp, a sugar beet farmer, worked with his family on their Weld County farm. They were trying to take out the beet crop before snowstorms had a chance to ruin it because that would drop their total crop yield. And if you know anything about farming, your money is based on how much crop you get. So they were out there toiling in the fields all day long, but by about 7 p.m., the crop was in, their job was done for the day, and Conrad was eating dinner with his family. Life carried on as normal for, the next 3 minutes. And then after those 3 minutes passed, Conrad was about to witness one of the most horrifying events of his life. At that point, he was only about 18 years old. Conrad stated that, quote, "We heard this loud explosion that shook all the windows in the house. We looked outside and we could hear the roar of the engines. That's how you knew it was a plane and the ball of fire coming through the air." End quote. The flight duration lasted approximately 39 minutes when 39 passengers, excluding the crew, were violently killed. Among the victims was an infant. Thankfully, as bad as this sounds, all victims reportedly died on impact, so their suffering was minimal, which is honestly, in my opinion, the best case scenario, other than people surviving without injuries. You really don't want people to be stuck there suffering and dying, so I'm glad that it was instantaneous and they didn't really have to suffer through anything super horrific. The plane is said to have landed in a Longmont, Colorado sugar beet farm, though the tail was missing. Now, having a missing tail to a plane crash really isn't super uncommon. By that I mean that planes often lose parts on the way down. There's usually a mechanical failure and then different forces acting on the plane itself, different to what it was intended for. So you lose wings, you lose tails, you can lose the cockpit, like weird things happen. So the fact that the tail was missing wasn't out of the ordinary. The problem happens when the plane explodes. So as you can imagine, the field of debris was incredibly large, about 6 square miles as it was reported. And to be completely honest, it's incredibly lucky that the plane landed in a field instead of a house or a residential area. I read that the plane weighed approximately 97,000 pounds, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the fact that its debris field was 6 square miles and nothing but farmland is a godsend because so many more people could have been hurt and killed. So thankfully, they weren't. Now, shortly after the plane crashed, Conrad and his brother Kenneth drove in the family truck to the crash site, or as close as they could get. There was a water canal that prevented them from completely crossing over in the vehicle. Once there, Conrad observed one of the passenger seats, and in the passenger seat was a lifeless body that was still strapped in. And at this point, the wreckage was so fresh that it was still smoldering and certain parts of it were still on fire. Conrad reported that his stomach, quote, hit the floor at the sight of the lifeless body and the carnage of the plane. Neighbors in the area arrived following smoke and sound to assist in any way they could. Like I said, there were unfortunately no survivors, but I do take comfort in knowing that a good group of people went out there with the intent to help and render aid where it was necessary. It's just unfortunate that it wasn't needed. Following the plane crash, the FBI sent a series of agents from the BID, which stands for Bureau's Identification Division, to help identify all persons aboard through fingerprint analysis. The team arrived at the crash site on November 2nd, and at this time, only 60% of the victims were identified, again, through fingerprints. You have to imagine that the injuries were probably quite extensive given the explosion and the aircraft hitting the ground and then exploding a second time. And we have to remember that this is 1955, so technology and science are pretty limited. DNA and fingerprint identification, like we know it today, were barely even a thought, let alone a dream at this time, so it was a significantly slower, more delicate process. Now, one of the victims actually ended up being the wife of an aide to President Eisenhower, which piqued public interest as well as legal interest by the authorities. Obviously, this is going to be something that the FBI wants to look into. You have to ask, was the plane targeted specifically because of this gentleman and his connection with the White House, or was it completely unrelated? It could have been a weird circumstance. It was a weird circumstance, but it's definitely something that you don't want to rule out because people have done weirder stuff for less. As for the remaining 40% of victims, their persons were identified by relatives through other characteristics, other features like tattoos, piercings, and then some were identified through their personal belongings, items that were on their bodies or in their luggage. One of the bodies, like I said, ended up being that of an infant, which is incredibly sad and very heartbreaking once you learn about the motive behind this whole thing. Once bodies were recovered and identified, the wreckage itself went under examination, which you would expect. If you ever get the chance to watch videos of how flight wreckage is reconstructed and how they analyze it, I highly recommend it. It's actually very fascinating and meticulous in the way that people are able to do this. Obviously, as of 2026, technology plays a big part in this, but at the time, it was all reconstructed by hand. It's absolutely mind-boggling. So if you ever get the chance to look that up, highly recommend it. It's baffling. Now, as a result of the reconstruction and examination, it was determined that the cause of the plane crash actually originated towards the rear of the plane. This is what led to the missing tail, which was completely and cleanly severed from the body of the plane. Like I said before, it's not uncommon for a tail to snap off of a plane during a rapid, uncontrolled descent, but the fact that it was such a clean break indicated an external force unrelated to the crash itself. The tail landed approximately 1.5 miles from the rest of the plane once it detached mid-flight. Again, somehow the tail managed to avoid any major residential areas, and as I mentioned earlier, the total size of the scene, it ended up being 6 square miles, which is a lot of area to cover for investigators, even an agency as large as the FBI. Part of the reason that it's as big as it is because the plane obviously is traveling down, so it's still flying and things are popping off and being dispersed or dropped on the way down. So just kind of puts it into perspective that plane crash scenes can have a very, very large radius. In order to determine the cause of the severed tail, United Airlines engineers and Douglas Aircraft Company technicians examined all of the plane's parts individually from November 2nd to November 7th. They ultimately ruled out a malfunction within the plane parts themselves, which would have led to the tail severing from the plane. Basically, they said, hey, we've gone over all the possible technical issues that would have led to this tail snapping off. We can't find anything that should have gone wrong. There's no way that tail should have come off without some sort of foul play. And because of that, a criminal investigation was announced by the Civil Aeronautics Board on November 7th, 1955, again, due to indications of sabotage within the plane. Consequently, the FBI launched an official investigation on November 8th, where all agents assigned to the case worked full-time until its closure. To put this in perspective, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, We have to kind of think about how everybody reacted during 9/11. Obviously, 9/11 was a much bigger event, much larger scale, but plane bombings weren't super common. Even, before 9/11, during 9/11, and after, we don't see it a lot. So anytime something like this happened, it was a major point of concern. And obviously, the biggest fear was whether or not other planes were going to be targeted. And we'll kind of talk about why this fear exists later on. With the FBI involved in running full throttle, background checks were performed on all crew and passengers of Flight 629, along with an examination of their luggage and their mail. Interviews were also performed, as would be expected, in order to glean more information from witnesses within the airport and those outside when the plane crashed. Amongst the 100-plus interviews, about 37 of the people questioned provided signed official statements for the FBI and their investigation. Because of these interviews, the investigation determined that an explosion was responsible for the severance of the plane's tail. According to witnesses, the plane was flying normally and didn't appear to be in any sort of trouble or distress before an explosion erupted at the rear. A second explosion followed suit when the body of the plane made impact with the ground. That explosion was likely due to the fuel tanks impacting the earth. After collecting information from interviews, a mock-up of the plane was recreated through wooden models in order to pinpoint the explosion's true origin. Through this, they determined that the explosion generated in cargo bay 4 of the plane. Notably, 4 pieces of sheet metal were discovered that didn't belong to the reconstruction of the plane or the plane itself. The best comparison I have for this is like trying to build IKEA furniture and ending up with four parts that belong to a couch. When you're trying to build a stool, it would stick out like a sore thumb. These guys are experts. They're going to be like, this has nothing to do with the plane. Why is this here? On top of that, one of the pieces of sheet metal had blue letters H and O painted onto it, and it was on a red background. The letters were originally investigated to see if there was any sort of significant meaning there. It was determined that there wasn't any outstanding meaning and that it was just a piece of metal that belonged to the detonation device of a bomb. While the mock-up and determination of foul play continued, further background checks were being implemented by FBI agents, and the name Daisy E. King became one of interest. Amongst her belongings on the plane were a series of personal letters, newspaper clippings regarding her son, a checkbook, $1,000 in traveler's checks, an address list, 2 keys, and a receipt for a safety deposit box rental placed under her name. Interestingly, one of the newspaper clippings in her luggage regarded Jack Gilbert Graham. Jack is more of a nickname. I believe his full legal name is John Gilbert Graham, but I call him Jack. Again, Jack is Mrs. King's son, who was on Denver County's most wanted list for forgery. And I gotta be honest, it's a little bit funny to think that you can end up on a most wanted list for forgery. I mean, forgery can definitely be a very serious crime. It's just not one that you hear very often, let alone one that puts you on a most wanted list. So I do think it's a little bit silly, but that's just my opinion. Furthermore, agents identified that insurance policies protecting Mrs. King from travel accidents like plane crashes, train crashes, boat crashes, car crashes, etc. had been mailed to Jack. One policy was for $37,500, and according to my calculations, that would place it at approximately $453,000 today. Out of the 6 total policies, 3 belonged to Mrs. King, and according to records, should Mrs. King pass, a large sum of inheritance money would go to Jack as well. The others, I believe, belonged to Jack. There's some conflicting statements there. That's why I say I believe. Some say that all of the policies were in his name, or he was the beneficiary. Others say maybe 2. The best estimate that I got is that out of the 6 policies, 3 were in her name and he was still the beneficiary, and then 3 were just for her. Now, if you are familiar with crime and true crime and everything like this, insurance money is incredibly suspicious and super interesting, especially to the FBI, because greed is one of the oldest motives in the book. And we all know, like I said, dozens of cases where life insurance was the ultimate motive for murder. So this is a big red flag for the FBI, and they hone in on this. And because of this, they end up identifying Jack as a suspect. And once they have him as a suspect, they delve deeper into not only Mrs. King's past, but Jack's past as well. And it's reported that Jack and his mom bickered regularly, and that Jack spent a significant amount of time living with relatives when he was little, up until the age of 16, when he was basically sent off on his own. Jack also spent time at Clayton College Orphanage in Denver after Mrs. King was widowed and unable to afford his upbringing. So Jack's biological father passed when he was roughly 3 years old. And then because she couldn't take care of him, she put him in an orphanage. Not only was Jack miserable while at the orphanage, he was often disciplined for his behavior. And to make matters worse, Mrs. King kept him there long after she ended up remarrying to somebody named Earl King, who was actually a wealthy rancher who definitely could support taking care of Jack. So this very clearly sent a message to Jack that he wasn't really wanted by his mom, because if the reason she gave him up was that she couldn't afford to take care of him, and she marries a wealthy man who very much could help take care of him, and then she doesn't come get him from the orphanage, I mean, 1 + 1 = 2. It's not hard to make that determination, even if you're a child. Kids know things. So Jack picked up on that. Eventually, Jack was caught stealing money from his mother's restaurant business, which was the first of many poor decisions in his life. And unfortunately for Mrs. King, that wasn't the only problem facing her restaurant, because at some point, an explosion damaged a large portion of the building. Jack was under investigation and explained this away by stating it had something to do with a gas leak, a hose, and some type of ignition point. However, Jack's tendency for trouble didn't stop at the accidental explosion. In fact, he actually bought a new truck and attempted to wreck it in a supposed insurance scheme. He explained that his truck had stalled on a set of train tracks and was consequently hit by a train, which sort of reminds me of that scene in a series of unfortunate events, the one with, why can't I think of his name? I can't think of his name, but it's the original movie, and it's where Count Olaf leaves the car on a set of train tracks, and he's like, oh, I'm gonna go get a drink from this gas station, hope the kids don't die. The authorities in Jack's case weren't able to prove that that was his intention, but then also given the forgery and the explosion, I mean, they kind of put 2 and 2 together and said, this is most likely what happened. Now, Jack's bouts of trouble didn't just stop in his daily life. Jack was part of the U.S. Coast Guard from April 1948 to January 1949, and while he was honorably discharged, he had gone AWOL for 63 consecutive days, which is something that is highly punished and frowned upon in all branches of the military, and I'm kind of surprised that he was honorably discharged, but that's up to his superiors, not me. Now, all of that being said, it's important to note that Jack wasn't educated beyond public school. He passed some high school entrance exams, but nothing came of it. Nothing really stuck. He didn't have goals to go on and apply to college or anything like that. Overall, he was described as a very wild kid who didn't understand the consequences of his actions. This was seen at the time as a result of Mrs. King sheltering him. And, like I said, he didn't really have a dad in the picture. Jack, his biological father died, like I said, when he was 3 years old. So Jack really got shipped around a lot, and I mean, I don't know how sheltered he was, but he did live a very sporadic and unpredictable life, both in adolescence and in adulthood. And while that doesn't excuse his behaviors, it kind of offers us a good bit of information to examine later on the more psychology side of things. But for now, we're going to continue with the rest of the investigation. Reports by Jack's wife indicated that Jack had given his mother a package the day she was packing for her trip to Alaska. So the flight that she was on was supposed to be a series of stops before she ended up in Alaska. That's why it was going to Portland. She was going to continue on to Alaska. This is, like I said, why she was on flight 629 to begin with. And according to Jack's wife, the package contained a tool set that Mrs. King could use to file and decorate seashells in order to make art. However, conflicts within the story soon arose, as Jack claimed that he never actually gave a tool set to his mother the day of her travels. He told investigators that he couldn't find the right set of tools, and so he didn't actually give her the gift. It just kind of fell through, and he never did anything with it. With the conflicting set of stories, more interviews were performed, as you would expect, on neighbors around Jack's home, along with additional family members. It's reported that after the plane crashed, Jack refused to eat or sleep and was soon aimlessly wandering the streets. While this can be chalked up to grief, a corroborating piece of material suggests otherwise. Reports state that when Jack was given news about the plane crash, he basically said, "Oh, that's it?" So he obviously became the prime suspect, and FBI agents consequently searched Jack's home and uncovered bomb making materials that led to Jack's eventual confession. Jack consequently explained how he made the bomb and how he got it aboard the plane. But the investigation didn't stop there. According to the History of Colorado, Jack explained the following to the FBI after waiving his rights. Jack told investigators he collected the parts and built the bomb on October 18th and 19th. The device included 25 sticks of dynamite, which is a lot, a timing device, an ever-ready 6-volt dry cell hotshot battery, and 2 dynamite caps, each connected to about 8 feet of wire. On the day of the flight, Daisy King went ahead to the Denver Motor Hotel, where she was leaving her car while she was in Alaska to visit her daughter Helen. That allowed Jack to put the homemade bomb in her luggage before picking up his mother, wife, and child en route to the airport. Once there, he carried the luggage for his mother. He then says, quote, "After my mother checked in, my wife and I went with her to the passenger gate where we told her goodbye and watched her board," end quote. He said goodbye to his mother and then watched dozens of innocent people, including an infant, board the flight, knowing damn well that every single one of them was going to be blown up, and he did not intend for there to be any survivors. If that wasn't damning enough, Jack's half-sister stepped forward and spoke with authorities to provide even more information about her brother. She claimed that Jack was always full of pent-up violence, that he found violent and cynical things funny. She explained to authorities that Jack had a knack for using dynamite, which is kind of weird. I don't feel like children should have a knack for using dynamite, but what do I know? She explained that at a previous job, he used dynamite to blow off a bolt that he couldn't remove by hand. The natural progression, you don't just get a better screwdriver or a better wrench, you just get a stick of dynamite. This brings back into question the explosion at Mrs. King's restaurant and whether or not it really was an accident. I think if we all put on our thinking caps, it's pretty safe to say that the explosion was intentional and Jack did it. And he's incredibly lucky that nobody was seriously hurt, but at the end of the day, I don't think he necessarily cared. Additionally, Jack's sister went on to state that Jack had a tendency to be violent towards her and his wife. That on 2 separate occasions, Jack had physically attacked her and threatened to hit her with a hammer. One time, Jack even slapped and backhanded his wife for playing poker at the table with his mother and sister. Jack's sister stated that not only was she afraid of her brother, but that his wife was too. So we see somebody who has a very big issue with women. He does not like women, most likely because of the way his mother behaved, putting him in an orphanage, shipping him off to relatives, even though she was married to a rich guy. She just really didn't want anything to do with him. There was likely a lot of resentment there. So Jack has a very lengthy criminal history, as you would say in the law enforcement business, and he's not a particularly good guy. Ultimately, Jack went on to not only confess, but he did go to trial, and he went to trial for obviously blowing up a bunch of people, but there was this discussion of laws pertaining to aerial bombings, because at the time there weren't really big guidelines on how to charge people for that. So he kind of put into motion this weird legal precedent. It sucks that something this bad had to happen, but he was kind of, in a way, put on trial for like a precedent in future legal cases where bombs on planes were a thing. Once he was convicted, he tried to kill himself in prison with a roll of socks and some cardboard. He was ultimately sentenced to death, and he was killed by gas chamber on January 11th, 1957 at 8:08 p.m., which honestly, the fact that this happened in 1955 and he was executed on 1957 is kind of impressive, because you could not get away with that in 2026. It would take years, decades most likely, and the person would likely die before they were executed anyways. So, with the details of the case laid out, I do want to take a deeper look at Jack and his psychological makeup. Again, I'm not making excuses for him, but I do think this is a particularly interesting case that has a lot of areas for discussion. To begin, we need to recognize that when bombings take place, a majority of the time they have to do with terrorism, political belief, religious or theological belief, or revenge and hatred on a very mass scale. Think of an airline employee who got fired. Well, they're going to take it out on the airline by bombing planes, things like that. Very rarely does a bombing take place solely for financial gain, but it's not necessarily unheard of. It's just very strange. And in this case, it's likely that Jack resorted to bombing not simply for financial gain, but due to a series of other factors as well, most likely stemming from the neglect he felt from his mom. Now, there's a few different types of bombers that we can look at. There's psychotic bombers who tend to suffer from paranoia, compulsive bombers who do it out of need and desire excitement, and then finally sociopathic bombers who lack guilt and moral dilemmas. To elaborate a little bit, when we talk about psychotic bombers who have paranoia, we're talking about people who have maybe delusions, that are seeing and hearing things, who may believe that they are blowing up a plane to stop, an actual threat, who don't necessarily realize that what it is they are doing is not for the greater good. We have compulsive bombers, like I said, who do it in a similar way that arsonists light fires. It gets them excited. They feel the need to do it. They can't not blow things up. It's something that drives them. It's something that they feel a deep desire to do. It helps them get their rocks off, basically, as the PG way of saying it. And then, obviously, there are the sociopathic bombers who do it because they don't care who gets caught in the crossfire. It's not necessarily for excitement itself, but because they want to be antisocial. They want to see how much carnage they can cause. It's not for the sake of just blowing something up. There's probably quite a few areas that I could elaborate on, but I'm not going to for the sake of time. But yeah, those are the main three categories: psychotic bombers, compulsive bombers, and sociopathic bombers. Given that little bit of elaboration, when we look at Jack's behavior, especially the behavior reported by witnesses after the plane crash, we can sort of narrow him down to a compulsive bomber. You may ask, why not a sociopathic one? I would say that's probably the second most likely option. But I would argue that even though Jack didn't explicitly show remorse for his actions, he was still very agitated, very distressed, indicating that he had some type of reservation about what it was that he did. And you guys have heard me talk about it before till I'm blue in the face, but this is probably a sign of cognitive dissonance. And just to remind you guys, the official definition is that the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. As a result of cognitive dissonance, people often feel ill, agitated, or distressed because their mind is in conflict, leading to a physical representation of that conflict. For instance, Jack just killed his mother, who he may not have liked, who he may have had a lot of resentment for, but he also killed a bunch of other people that he didn't have a lot of resentment for. I think that morally a person can recognize murder is wrong, and since they took actions against that moral belief, cognitive dissonance may apply. I also think given his history where there's the past explosion, and there's another explosion referenced by his sister where he blew something up at work, he's also doing it for excitement. So I think he's more likely a compulsive bomber than he would be a psychotic or sociopathic bomber. The best kind of analogy I can give is, let's say, hypothetically, you are very, very, very against stealing. I mean, you hate it. You absolutely despise it. It makes you upset. You go your whole entire life condemning thieves, talking about how bad they are, how much you hate them, how they make prices go up. And then you fall on hard times. And you are incredibly poor, homeless even. And so you steal food. And as a result, you feel incredibly guilty. You feel agitated. You feel distressed. upset, disappointed in yourself, etc., you know, you have now gone against something that you've believed for a very, very long time. So while Jack may have despised his mother and wanted financial gain, everybody knows murder is wrong. And at the very least, you know that people who have nothing to do with your plight should not be killed. So I think that, you know, it's not unreasonable to say he was going through a very large episode of cognitive dissonance where he's having to reckon with the fact that, yeah, he wanted his mom dead, but that's one person, and there's 43 other people that he killed as well. We can also corroborate the idea, like I said, that Jack is a compulsive bomber due to the restaurant incident and then the one at the workplace that his sister mentioned. And understanding that Jack is a compulsive bomber puts into perspective a series of other behaviors and events in his life. For instance, a lack of schooling, which I talked about. He had very little high school education, had no aspirations to go to college, anything like that. I ended up writing a paper on arsonists for my junior year criminology class, and while I was doing that, I actually learned that not only do arsonists tend to lack education, but bombers do too. And there's an interesting overlap there. They actually have a lot of similar characteristics and behaviors. Arsonists and bombers are mainly men with personality disorders who have a lack of education and have a lot of relationship issues. Granted, there are always going to be outliers to every case, but I don't think that's Jack in this instance. Given what we know about Jack, he identifies as male. He has a very low education level. He struggled with developing a relationship with his mother, with his half-sister, and then with his wife, obviously with the violence that took place. Additionally, we can look at the effects these lack of relationships had on him as well, because he didn't have a father figure. From my understanding, Jack did not have a good relationship not only with his mother, but with his stepfather either, because again, this man very easily could have taken care of Jack. He just chose not to. Now, I will caveat this, that while I read stories pertaining to what I'm going to talk about, and while I read research pertaining to what I'm going to talk about, this is not always the case. So please take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. However, there is research that supports the things I'm going to talk about. So, young boys, in many instances, do have behavioral problems as a result of a father being absent, or the result of an absent father. Little boys often accumulate anxieties and fears when they don't have the consistent presence of a father, which often manifests into behavioral issues and attention-seeking behaviors. Boys without fathers are more likely to grow up to be aggressive and may be more likely to be quick to anger. There you go, guys. I promise I'm not having a stroke. Anywho, that said, Jack's violent outbursts towards his wife, his sister, his mom, those are all indicators of that. It kind of corroborates those bits of research. Now, like I said, there are plenty of young men out there who don't have these habits, who don't have these behaviors, despite not having a present father. But that's also because it was counteracted by having a loving mother and having other male figures who cared about them. Jack did not have a mother that seemed to particularly give a shit about him, and he sure shit didn't have a stepfather that cared about him. And the orphanage, from what it sounds like, didn't treat him very well either. And from the look and sound of things, Jack really didn't have much of a shot when it came to emotional stability, given the fact that his mother was emotionally unavailable. And so, really, the only way to get her attention is to do risk-seeking behavior. And that's not uncommon for boys who have emotionally unavailable mothers. They will do things that, to a normal individual and from an outside perspective, may seem batshit crazy, such as playing with explosives or wanting to wreck your car for insurance purposes, things like that. On top of that, kids often struggle at school. And I already talked about Jack's schooling issues in the sense that he underperformed and he didn't go beyond basically grade school. So he kind of he does check a lot of boxes for someone who would have behavioral issues because of the neglect that he had from his parents. Now, this obviously brings into question the nature versus nurture argument, which is posed all the time in forensic psychology. And what I can tell you is it is not one or the other. I am a firm believer that nature and nurture have to go hand in hand. You don't just magically make a psychopath. There are people who are actually very successful as people who have psychopathy. They actually make incredibly prolific businessmen. You see it in billionaires, you see it in millionaires, you see it in investors. They actually rank very high on psychopathy scales. So you can be, in a way, productive in society without blowing people up. But yeah, I think it's nature and nurture. And so I can't look at Jack and say specifically, well, he was always going to be a compulsive bomber, because that's not true. He may have had a propensity for it, but I do think his environment also played a role and helped exacerbate some of the issues that he very clearly had. Ultimately, a lot of Jack's life during his developmental years explains his behaviors later in life. And while it doesn't excuse the fact that he bombed a plane and killed 44 people, it does give us insight as to why things progressed the way they did. And if his behaviors had been identified and picked up on in the beginning, it's likely he wouldn't have escalated to blowing up a plane. Again, this was the 1950s. So topics regarding abandonment issues, compulsive tendencies, compulsive bombing, domestic violence, etc., they weren't talked about, plain and simple. It's not like it is today where you can sit down and have a conversation and say, hey, dude, these things that you're doing, they're not okay. Let me get you professional psychological help. So that it just didn't happen. So he kind of got screwed in that regard as well. And if Jack was really as sheltered from things as some people claim, granted this would have been later in life due to his living with relatives, his mother likely ignored a lot of the behaviors that she was seeing when she should have taken them as warning signs. Granted, this would have been after the orphanage, because remember, she put him in an orphanage, so any behavior issues he was having there, she wouldn't have been privy to. So this would have been after he was released from the orphanage and spending time with relatives. So these behaviors had ample time to manifest, to become worse, to grow, and instead of identifying them as potentially being weird, it was just hush hush. People don't talk about it. This is just how it is in the 50s. So I think it's not her fault, right? I just think that if this were in a different time, or she had taken more notice of the things that he was doing, he maybe could have gotten some help. It definitely wouldn't have been to the extent that we, would help somebody in 2026, but I think something may have been better than nothing, and at the very least, maybe it could have been prevented by, who knows, medications, keeping closer supervision on him, etc. But also, I mean, who realistically thinks that their kid's going to put a bomb on a plane and blow them up along with 43 other people? So we can what if this to death. I just think it's an interesting talking point. Overall, what happened was an immense tragedy. And like I said, while it's easy to point out the psychological and behavioral markers in retrospect, it's not as easy in the present. There's also a likelihood that she really didn't want to believe these things were present in her son. She may have had rose-colored glasses, and, that's not uncommon for parents. So, who knows what the circumstances are. The sad reality, as seen in this case, is that sometimes you can't stop the problem before it gets there. Especially if no one does anything regarding the problem in the first place. Again, 1950s, so realistically, how much could anybody have done? At the end of the day, I do want to say that my heart goes out to the families and relatives of the victims. I mean, plane crashes in and of themselves are unfathomable. They are very difficult for me to wrap my mind around. But I think it's almost harder to wrap your mind around the fact that, outside of a plane crash, you shouldn't die on an airplane unless it's like a major medical event. You have an aneurysm, you have a heart attack, something like that. Nobody thinks, oh, my relative's going to get on this plane and there's going to be a bomb in the cargo bay and it's going to blow up. So I cannot imagine I can't imagine the whiplash that they got to think, oh, my relative was blown up in a plane. Like, that's so out of left field, so diabolical and just fucked up, to be honest. I don't think I will ever be able to relate to that. I can't even pretend like I can. I myself have never experienced anything like that. It's really difficult to wrap your mind around. Frankly, I don't quite know what to say about it, but it sucks, and it's a tragedy. And to think that there was also an infant on board, I mean, nobody prepares you for that. And I'm actually glad, as messed up as it sounds, that we have a lot more security when it comes to airports and planes after 9/11, because I think we needed it. I think it should have been something that was around for a very long time. It may have prevented this from happening. It just sucks that sometimes tragedies have to happen for there to be change. And I hate that. I hate it so much, because then you can look back and go, oh, well, we should have been doing this the whole time. But my point is that this was a really shitty situation, and it never should have gotten this far. And this guy, Jack, as messed up as he may have been, due to psychological and behavioral issues and childhood issues, he never should have thought about killing anybody in the first place, let alone taking out 43 other people. Murdering one individual is bad enough, but taking out 43 other people who had nothing to do with your family and the dynamic, unspeakable. And so I think he got what he deserved as far as the gas chamber goes. I don't have much else to say on that. I don't want to make it as depressing as it is already. So I do think that when we look at cases like this, we can learn and grow from them in order to prevent future mass tragedies like this. This is not a case that I was super familiar with. I was actually very surprised to come across this. There are warning signs. And like I said, this happened in the 1950s, so they may not have been as known or as noticeable. But as of 2026, I don't think there's much of an excuse for dozens of people to not know that something is going on with somebody. And at the end of the day, there's only so much that we can do as outsiders looking in, or as family members. The responsibility does fall on the perpetrator. But I do think that in today's day and age, we can't necessarily get away with wearing our rose-colored glasses about behaviors that present in a way which are genuinely and legitimately concerning. If you have somebody who is constantly lighting fires, who is constantly blowing things up, it's not, hey, boys will be boys. It's, this might be a problem. This might be something we need to look into. And if anything, this case is a prime example of that, and a warning of what can happen if these behaviors are unchecked. With that said, I want to thank all of you guys for clicking on this video or this podcast episode. I do hope you learned something new here, and if I piqued your interest enough, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. It really helps, and it helps me create more content like this in the future. I'm going to continue to do my research on the Epstein files. I am going to, as I mentioned before, mix in videos like this, because I don't want to lose touch with the fact that there's other people out there who've been victimized, and lose touch with the fact that there's other cases that we can learn from. So keep that in mind if it's not something that you're used to. If you come to this channel specifically for my Epstein content, I appreciate it. Thank you. I think spreading the word about that and detailing that is incredibly important, but I also don't want to lose sight of what this channel's purpose is, and that is to educate on warning signs with psychological issues, educate on psychological behavior, and show that, sometimes perpetrators have really unfortunate beginnings, and they don't get the help that they need. And yes, it is still entirely their fault for the actions that they take, but we as a society and as a system need to do better about recognizing these issues before they get to the point where people are blowing up planes. That's all I have to say. Hopefully I'm not beating a dead horse, but thank you guys again. And please, in the meantime, stay safe, take care of each other, and as always, stay psyched out.